In the dark heart of the Spanish Inquisition there was a device so cruel it silenced entire villages. It looked like nothing more than a wooden beam, but its sharp edge tore through flesh like a blade. They called it the Spanish donkey. Prisoners were forced to straddle it while iron weights dragged their bodies down, splitting them apart inch by inch. Some confessed within minutes. Others endured until their screams became whispers. And one man, a blacksmith named Mateo, paid the ultimate price for a single forbidden book. His story is not just about torture, but about power, fear, and the price of holding on to truth. The stone corridors of 16th century Spain were always cold, even under the harsh summer sun. But colder still was the fear that clung to the people like a second skin. At the heart of that fear stood the Spanish Inquisition, a force that promised salvation for the soul but delivered agony for the body. Villagers whispered about its prisons, its courts, and above all its punishments. And among the many tools of torment, one carried a reputation that chilled blood faster than winter winds. It was called la cuña, the wedge. To most, it was known more simply as the Spanish donkey. The device looked harmless from a distance, almost crude. Just a long wooden beam, sharpened into a wedge along its back, raised high on sturdy supports. But its design carried a particular genius of cruelty. Victims were forced to straddle the sharp ridge as if mounting a horse. Then iron weights were strapped to their ankles, dragging them downward, pressing their bodies against the unforgiving edge. Every added pound drove the wedge deeper, splitting flesh, tearing muscle, grinding bone. Those who endured it described the sensation not as pain, but as the body itself being ripped apart from within. The Spanish donkey was not simply a method of punishment. It was theater. The Inquisition used it to break spirits, to terrify crowds, and to remind everyone that defying authority meant war against your own body. Some prisoners confessed within minutes, screaming out names of friends, neighbors, even family, just to be lifted from its edge. Others endured longer, but their silence always ended in the same way: broken bodies, shattered minds, or lifeless corpses. Yet for all its infamy, the donkey was faceless without the people who suffered. Upon it, behind every punishment, was a man or woman whose only crime was to believe differently, to speak unwisely, or to be betrayed by someone they trusted. These stories rarely survived, erased from records by the very men who ordered the tortures. But sometimes, whispers carried them through the centuries. One such whisper belonged to a blacksmith named Mateo. He was not a noble, not a scholar, and certainly not a rebel. He was just a craftsman, known for his strong ironwork and quiet demeanor. But one secret mistake, one book hidden beneath his workshop floorboards, set him on a path toward the Inquisition's chamber. His fate would be decided not by a jury, but by the sharp spine of the donkey itself. Mateo's forge had always been a place of rhythm, the hammer striking hot metal, sparks leaping like fireflies, the hiss of iron plunged into water. He was respected in his small village. Farmers trusted his plows, soldiers relied on his blades, and neighbors admired the durability of his work. Yet despite his skill, Mateo remained humble, a quiet man who spoke little, drank sparingly, and kept his circle of trust small. But in that quietness he carried a dangerous secret, a forbidden book hidden beneath the wooden planks of his workshop. It was not a book of spells or blasphemous rituals. To Mateo, it was nothing more than words of wisdom, copied from old manuscripts, once kept by monks. The passages spoke of reason, of questioning what was taught, of searching for truth beyond what was decreed by authority. For a man who worked with fire and iron every day, it was a comfort to read words that felt alive, sharp, and free. But to the church, such words were poison. Ideas were more dangerous than swords, and ideas that encouraged doubt were treated as heresy. One evening, while Mateo was shaping a plowshare, soldiers stormed his forge. A neighbor, perhaps jealous of his skill or fearful of suspicion, had whispered his name to the priest. They ransacked his home, tore up the planks, and dragged out the book as proof of his sin. His wife cried out, clutching their young daughter, but no plea could soften the cold armor of the Inquisition's men. Mateo's hands, once used to shape iron, were bound in chains. He was thrown into a cart as the villagers watched in silence, some pitying, others relieved that suspicion had fallen on someone else. The journey to the city was long, each jolt of the cart biting his wrists where the shackles cut deep. Along the way, Mateo thought of the stories he had heard, of men who disappeared into the Inquisition's dungeons, of screams that echoed through stone walls, of the tortures whispered by those who had seen them. The rack, the Iron Maiden, the dreaded donkey. Until that night, he had dismissed them as warnings meant to frighten, but now, the shadow of those devices loomed over him like vultures circling their prey. When he arrived at the tribunal, robed priests read out his charges: heresy, blasphemy, the spreading of dangerous texts. His protests were drowned beneath accusations, his voice no match for the weight of authority. The verdict was already decided. As the guards dragged him into the cold dungeons below, Mateo understood one thing with absolute clarity. He would not be judged by truth but by how much agony his body could endure. The Spanish donkey awaited. The dungeon was not meant for the living. Its air was damp, heavy with the stench of rot and sweat. Rats skittered along the walls, feeding on crumbs that fell from the bowls of thin gruel given to prisoners. Mateo was shoved into a narrow cell, where a single torch flickered outside the iron bars. He sat on the cold stone floor, wrists still shackled, his back aching from the rough journey. The silence was broken only by distant cries, anguished voices that rose, trembled, and then were suddenly cut off. For days, Mateo was left to wait, bread too stale to chew, water tasting of rust, sleep broken by the screams of others. The waiting was its own kind of torture. Fear gnawed at his mind like a slow, invisible worm. He imagined the donkey every night, its sharp spine pressing into his flesh. He tried to pray, but even prayers felt hollow in this place. Then one morning the guards came. They pulled him up roughly, his legs weak from hunger. He was dragged through a maze of corridors until he entered a chamber lit by dozens of candles. Shadows danced across the stone walls, making the room feel alive. At its center stood the tribunal, a panel of priests in dark robes, their faces unreadable, their eyes sharp as knives. And in the far corner, half hidden in shadow, stood the Spanish donkey. Mateo's stomach turned at the sight of it. From a distance, it looked like a carpenter's bench, crude and unassuming. But the wedge that formed its back gleamed in the candlelight, polished by the countless bodies that had been forced upon it. Chains dangled from its sides and iron weights lay piled nearby, waiting like silent executioners. "Mateo," one of the priests intoned, "you are accused of heresy against the Holy Church. You may confess now and spare yourself unnecessary suffering." Mateo's voice cracked as he pleaded his innocence. He explained that the book was not dangerous, that he had never spread rebellion, that he was only a blacksmith who loved words as much as iron. His cries echoed, but the tribunal remained unmoved. To them, a confession was not truth. It was submission. The head priest gave a slow nod. The guards stepped forward. Mateo's chains were unfastened only to be replaced with thicker shackles attached to ropes. He struggled, but his strength was nothing against their grip. His eyes darted once more to the donkey. For the first time in his life, the blacksmith who had shaped blades and bent iron felt what it meant to be truly powerless. The guards forced Mateo toward the wooden frame. His legs trembled so violently that he stumbled, his knees scraping against the stone floor. They pulled him upright and positioned him over the wedge. He realized, with a sickening clarity, that they intended to make him climb the donkey as if mounting a horse. His breath came in short, panicked gasps. "Please," he whispered. But his words fell into silence. The men pushed him onto the sharp ridge. The edge cut into his thighs immediately, even through the rough wool of his trousers. Pain jolted upward, like lightning, and Mateo's fingers gripped the wood until his knuckles turned white. He shifted, trying to ease the pressure, but every movement drove the wedge deeper. Then came the weights. Iron blocks were tied to his ankles with thick ropes. At first only a few pounds. His body sank slightly, the wood biting harder into him. The tribunal watched in silence, their faces blank as if this were no more than a routine. The guards added more weights, slowly, deliberately. Mateo's breath turned into ragged screams. The sensation was beyond anything he had ever imagined, like his very body was being split open from the inside. Sweat poured down his face, soaking his shirt. His muscles spasmed uncontrollably. Every instinct told him to lift himself off the wedge, but the ropes and gravity held him fast. He thought of his forge, of the heat of the fire, of the rhythm of hammer and anvil. How simple that pain had been compared to this. How innocent the burn of molten iron on skin was when set against the cruelty of the donkey. The priests finally spoke. "Confess, Mateo. Admit your heresy, and this can end." But how could he confess to a lie? He had never sought to defy the church. He had only loved words. Through his tears he shook his head weakly. "I am no heretic," he gasped. The tribunal gave another nod. More weights were tied. His body sank lower, and the wood cut deeper, tearing through flesh. Mateo's scream echoed through the chamber until it was hoarse, breaking into sobs. His strength was fading, but still, he clung to his truth. The donkey, however, had patience, and the men who commanded it had no need to hurry. Hours blurred into something unmeasurable. The chamber seemed suspended outside of time, every second stretched by the sound of Mateo's ragged cries. Sweat and blood mixed beneath him, staining the wedge. His thighs burned, his legs shook violently, and yet the priests showed no sign of mercy. The Spanish donkey had been designed for this exact purpose, to keep pain alive, to make it grow with every heartbeat. Mateo's thoughts drifted in broken fragments. He remembered his daughter chasing butterflies in the meadow, his wife kneading bread at dawn, the ringing song of his hammer echoing through the forge. These memories came to him not as comfort but as torment, cruel reminders of the life he was losing with every passing moment. The wedge cut deeper, forcing him to bend forward, his chest heaving as if the air itself weighed too much. The guards watched with practiced detachment. They had seen this before, dozens of times, and Mateo was no different from the others. They tightened the ropes and added another iron block to his ankles. The weight dragged him lower still until his body convulsed in agony. A scream tore from his throat, but his voice was raw, shredded by hours of pleading. What came out now was more a rasp than a cry. "Confess," one of the priests commanded again, his voice steady, almost bored. "Admit your heresy and you may yet be spared." The offer was a cruel trick, and Mateo knew it. Even if he confessed, the Inquisition rarely let prisoners go free. At best, he would live long enough to face public humiliation, maybe the stake. At worst, they would silence him permanently. Confession meant nothing but surrender. Still, a part of him longed to speak the words, if only to stop the torment. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. His pride as a craftsman, his love for truth, and his fear of condemning himself with a lie held him still. His silence was an act of resistance, the last thing he could control. The tribunal grew impatient. Another nod was given, and the guards lowered yet more iron. His legs were trembling so violently that they no longer seemed his own. He felt as if his body was being split in two, the wedge digging deeper with no end. Tears blurred his vision. He could not tell where the chamber ended and the shadows began. He was breaking, not just in flesh, but in spirit. When the end finally came, it was not sudden. It crept upon Mateo quietly as exhaustion dulled even the sharpest edge of pain. His screams had faded into shallow gasps, his head slumped forward, his body trembling like a bowstring stretched. Too far. The guards, seeing his strength nearly gone, paused in their work. The priests whispered among themselves, their voices low and distant, as though they stood at the other end of a long tunnel. The donkey had done its work. Whether Mateo confessed or not hardly mattered anymore. His body was broken, his will shattered, his story sealed. For the tribunal, this was victory, not because truth had been revealed, but because fear had been reaffirmed. Every man or woman who would later hear whispers of Mateo's fate would think twice before questioning authority, before reading forbidden words, before even daring to dream of freedom. That was the donkey's true purpose. The guards untied him at last, not out of mercy, but to drag him back to his cell. His legs gave way instantly, bloodied and mangled. He collapsed onto the floor, too weak to stand, too weak even to groan. He was carried away like a sack of grain, a man reduced to little more than a cautionary tale. No records survive of what became of Mateo after that day. Perhaps he died in his cell, his body unable to heal from such wounds. Perhaps he lingered a while, a hollow shell of the blacksmith he once was. The Inquisition would not have cared either way. His punishment had already served its purpose. Yet, the story of Mateo, like so many others, did not vanish. Whispers carried it from village to village, told in taverns late at night, shared in hushed tones by those who dared to remember. The Spanish donkey itself became a legend, a symbol of human cruelty at its most calculated. It was a reminder that sometimes the simplest tools could create the deepest horrors, and so centuries later we still speak of it, not because we admire it, but because we must remember it. For within the cruelty of the donkey lies a warning that when fear is used as power, when authority silences truth with pain, ordinary people like Mateo become sacrifices to a system that thrives on suffering. The donkey may be gone, rotting, away in forgotten prisons, but its shadow still lingers, a scar in human history we cannot afford to forget. The Spanish donkey was more than torture. It was fear carved into wood. It silenced voices, broke bodies, and turned truth into a crime. Mateo's story reminds us that even ordinary people can become targets when power fears knowledge. The priests who judged him are forgotten, but the blacksmith who endured the donkey is remembered. His suffering stands as a warning. When cruelty becomes law, humanity itself is put on trial.